So, folks, I'm here to ask you a question. How many transgender people does it take to change a light bulb? That's the question we're hoping to answer today. For the record, I identify as female. My pronouns are she, her. I don't identify as male or non-binary or gender fluid or two-spirit or any of the other gender identities that there are, but I support them 100%. The idea of a third or more gender seems like a new concept to many. Yet, civilizations across the world have recognized more than two genders for as long as they've existed. Being transgender or gender fluid is not a new Western creation. Native American culture has two-spirit people. India has hijras. There are Mujse in Mexico and Bakla in the Philippines. These are all some form of transgender or gender fluid identities. I'll just get the following slides. And next one. And next one. And next one. And last one. Thank you. But our culture made a deliberate attempt to erase these people and their identities. We tried to cast them out of society. The fight for transgender rights goes back a long time. Next slide, please. Magnus Hirschfeld, here on the right, was a German-Polish sexologist born in Poland in 1868 and moved to Berlin at a young age. He helped transgender people obtain medical assistance and IDs. He also helped progress LGBT plus equality within the Berlin Police Department by working with them on eradicating discrimination within the police. And he wrote one of the first books on trans people. Next slide, please. Berlin's Third Sex. The next slide shows a photo of Nazis burning his work. In this fire, there are many accounts and records of trans people worked on by Magnus Hirschfeld through the Institute of Sexual Research, which he founded. Yet another attempt to erase trans people from the world. These burnings set trans rights back a long time because so much information was lost. Many people tell us that our struggle is new, that our fight is new, and that someday we will have equal rights, and that we just need to be patient. But history shows us that we're not new, it's just our struggle was long forgotten. Next slide, please. We never went extinct, we were always there, but we were oppressed to the point where it became almost impossible for us to live our lives the way we felt comfortable. There is no rise in transgender people, there's just a rise in the amount of people who now feel that we've become accepting enough of a society that they can finally be their true selves. But our attempts at freedom are still being oppressed. From the 1960s and before, when police were raiding gay bars, next slide please, to 2022, when politicians are actively working to write transgender people out of existence, our rights are still under attack. Growing up in a small, Catholic, conservative village like mine, if you're in any bit different to the traditional farming culture, you were an outcast. So help you if you're gay, but never mind trans. Either of which would be headline news for the next 6 months. There is a lack of education around what being transgender is and how you become trans. If you experience gender dysphoria, and you generally know at a young age that something is different about you. Growing up with that gender dysphoria is difficult, but you can't just go on hormones overnight and begin a medical transition. You have to convince a number of medical professionals that you are trans. You need confirmation from 2 psychologists that they believe you're transgender. Usually this involves hours of sessions, speaking in deep personal detail, and being asked a myriad of sexually explicit questions to determine whether you are who you say you are. And it will almost certainly be 3 to 10 years before you ever get your hands on a bottle of estrogen or testosterone for trans men. But there is also misinformation from right-wing media and politicians on the rise and danger of transgender people. They create a discourse that cisgender women aren't safe in the bathroom with a trans woman. But this is an intentional attempt to drive fear and transphobia towards trans people. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. Trans women pose no threat to cis women, but we pose a threat to them if we make them outcasts. This is Rebecca Solnit. She's a feminist historian, activist, and writer. Cisgender women are safe in women-only spaces, which include transgender people. Trans people are not a threat, and very often they also need that refuge just as much as cisgender women do. Despite attempts by politicians to politicize this issue and attempt to ban trans women from these spaces. Next slide, please. US Republican congressmen are actively working to ban trans women from society, but here's a fact they won't talk about. More US congressmen have been convicted of bathroom sexual assaults than trans women. I had to look at the numbers, and depending on the sources, between 3 and 7 Republican congressmen. For trans women, it's 0. Trans women are also not a threat to women's sports, despite what many old white cisgender men will try to tell you. In June this year, FINA, which is the world governing body of swimming, next slide please, has banned most trans women from women's elite swimming. This decision was an opinion, and the reason for this decision, which is that trans women have a biological advantage over cis women in sports, was an opinion of those who made it and not based on science. Very little research has actually been done on whether trans women have an advantage over cis women in sports, and therefore there is no evidence that trans women do have an advantage. Firstly, many trans women begin puberty blockers as an adolescent, and those who do never go through testosterone-based puberty. At that stage, if they're on hormones, they will also have the physiology of a woman. For trans women who start their journey later in life, research shows that we have 7 kilograms less muscle mass than cisgender men. Trans women also lose bone density, making us much more susceptible to osteoporosis. And red blood cells drop to female levels. For context on why red blood cells is relevant there, blood doping in sports happens by increasing red blood cells, and estrogen will drop those. When I went through male puberty, that doesn't give me an advantage over all cisgender women. I certainly wouldn't like to take on Serena Williams in tennis or Kelly Harrington in boxing, because that would almost certainly be the last thing I'd ever do. The reality is that many cisgender women also have advantages in terms of strength and height over other cisgender women. Just like other genders, some women are naturally taller than average, or shorter than average, or stronger than average, or weaker than average. Yet parliaments across the world continue to pass legislation to exclude trans people, which just doesn't match the science. Or they won't pass legislation to protect trans people, such as banning conversion therapy or hate crime. Here in Ireland, we have waiting lists of 5 or more years just for an initial consultation for endocrinology. And there's 2 endocrinologists in the country who can deal with trans people through the public system. And they're both in the Dublin region. There's one in Dublin and one in Drogheda, meaning that any trans person in Ireland going through the public system who wants access to endocrinology has to travel towards Dublin. Many of you in this room would have probably would have started puberty somewhere between 12, 14 or thereabouts, and so did I. But I'm also going through puberty now at 24 for a second time, because hormones put you through a second puberty. I started hormones 2 years ago, and therefore I've been going through 2 years so far of female puberty, which isn't always easy. But if I get emotional over something very small, it is always an interesting reaction when you reply with, "Sorry, I'm going through puberty." But let's not stop there, because remember, in Ireland, we are big fans of unnecessarily exporting people for much needed healthcare. We always have. For years, women had to travel abroad for reproductive healthcare, and in many cases, they still do. Trans people also have to go abroad for certain healthcare treatments that are not available in Ireland. The cost of being transgender, even with health insurance, can very often run into 6 figures, and financial support is basically non-existent. So are transgender rights moving forward or moving back? It kind of seems like a mixture of both. It seems as if we take 2 steps forward in terms of social and societal views, but we take 1 step back in terms of political and legislative change. There is no doubt that the world is becoming, as a whole, is becoming more understanding of the fight for trans rights and will more likely be accepting of who we are. But we still have parliaments and politicians writing legislation based on fear-driven opinions rather than scientific facts. We have governments introducing bans on conversion practices, and these bans don't include conversion practices on targeting trans people, despite no scientific evidence that that should be the case. So, to answer the question of how many transgender people does it take to change a light bulb, I'll get the next slide, please. And the next one. And the next one, please. The answer is just 1. But first, you have to spend a year living in the dark, get written approval from 2 different electricians to confirm that it does, in fact, actually need changing. You have to paint the room pink in the meantime to prove that you do want a lighter room, and be asked if you have a fetish for well-lit rooms. That, folks, is the life of a trans person. But we're strong, and we'll break through the noise. I mean, after all, having an orchiectomy really takes balls. We're not asking for special treatment, we're asking for equality. We're asking for equal access in housing, education, employment, and society as a whole. We're asking to be consulted with, nothing about us without us. Because all too often we are left out of the conversations and decision-making around the laws that directly impact our lives and our safety. We're asking all of you to listen to us when we speak about preferred language and pronouns. If you make a mistake with someone's preferred pronouns and you realize or they correct you, don't spend the next 10 minutes apologizing. Just acknowledge it and move on. We don't need an apology for a big, long apology for a genuine mistake. We're all human. We all do it from time to time. I've made mistakes with other transgender and non-binary friends. But we live in a society where we find it so easy to apologize to our friend's dog when we misgender them, much more than we do to apologize to our friend for misgendering them. And we live in a society where people will happily gender their car or their country or their house, but not go based on their friend's preferred pronouns. And finally, I know there's some politicians here tonight. You've heard the statistics. We're asking that when you legislate based on facts. And in 2022 and beyond, let's allow facts and not fear to drive transgender policymaking. Thank you.